Hi, hey, how's it going there? This is Gary D, the original Unhacker, with a quick video, hoping to dispel some common misconceptions regarding some of the sort of cybersecurity hacking topics that have come up in election 2016. So let's get into that. Just real briefly, I think we can start with the post service. So let's say I wanted to send a note of congratulations to the New York Times for their excellent coverage in the 2016 election. And I would put my address up here, and I'm just going to say Gary D instead. So that's where you can find me on Twitter. And so maybe I would put my note inside the envelope, and then I would send it off to New York. And over in New York, they would get it, and they'd open it up, and they'd say, "Oh, isn't that pleasant, this nice note of congratulations from Gary D." They might decide to send me a response. In the address field, they would put the address that I had put there. So they would say, "Hey, send this to Gary D from courtesy of the New York Times." And they would put their little note in there too, right? So they put their note in there, and they would send it back to me over in California. So far, this is a pretty, if simplified, fairly accurate description of how the internet and your browser work in order to get the news from the New York Times. I would open it up and then get, in this case, their smiley face. But in the case of your web browser or your mobile device, it would be the news or whatever page you were requesting. This scenario changes a bit, however, in what we call a denial of service or distributed denial of service attack or any of those other scenarios, in the sense that I don't really care about the response that they send back to me. And so when I choose to send them, say, something mean, I'll just send them and say it could even be empty, actually. It could be the equivalent of an empty envelope. So I would still send it to the New York Times, except it doesn't matter what I put right here. So I could put my real address, but why would I? I could just put anything else here, right? And we're going to say it's from Bill Clinton. And when Bill Clinton sends it over to the New York Times, in this case it'll be their web server, represented here by a Raspberry Pi, which you should get. And they will open it up at the New York Times and say they may have to respond to it anyways. So they'll send an answer back. But where will they send it to? They need to send it back to Bill Clinton, right? Which is where it originally came from. So, but mind you, Bill Clinton didn't actually send this, so the response is going to be ignored. It doesn't really matter. This is important. It doesn't really matter what happens to their response. It doesn't matter where they're sending it back to. So this is the situation that leads to a denial of service attack to begin with. It's less work for me to send an ill-sourced addressed envelope to the New York Times than it is for the New York Times to actually open it and process it and send the necessary content or whatever sort of response is required back to me. And since this is less work for me than it is for them, this is the dynamic that leads to a denial of service attack in the first place. This is why it's strategically advantageous for the attacker. Furthermore, as I said, they could be addressed from anywhere. So as the New York Times begins receiving requests that appear to come from anywhere, and they could come from just about anywhere, and they'll have to respond to them, each one of them, in kind. And this is, as I said, a tremendous amount of work. But while they're doing this, they'll be getting more stuff from other places. Some of these might even be valid requests. See, Bob from Dakota here actually does want the thing. But the New York Times, you'll find, won't have time to respond to all of this because it has to open all of these requests. So fairly soon, the New York Times or the destination, the target in question, will be inundated with these false requests. Whether or not they respond to them is irrelevant, except, of course, for Bob from Dakota, who actually is waiting to get the news. Inevitably, the server systems will fall over themselves and the game is over. But the important part of this, even if the servers don't fail, they still won't be able to respond in time to Bob from Dakota and people who actually do want the news. So it's effective as an attack technique, and this is why it remains popular to this day. The real problem with this is and what I want to highlight in this video is in reviewing these records of where these came from. And the important thing here is that obviously reviewing these sources, apparent sources, tells us nothing really about where they might have come from. It might tell us something, but it doesn't tell us this. It doesn't tell us necessarily that Jim Morrison really is hiding out in Spain. Whether or not whether or not the attacker might be included among those addresses really depends on the scenario. But the important thing is here that there's no way to verify which of these might be valid. So even if you did pull out some of these and say, well, 2% of them might be valid, you don't know which of them is the valid ones. So this is an important factor which complicates the matter of attribution, which is one of the major challenges of cybersecurity and one of the reasons you should probably get into cybersecurity. It is a fascinating field, obviously. Now, this applies pretty specifically to denial of service attacks. There are other forms of attacks and stuff that don't really share this same dynamic, but this analogy is consistent with denial of service attack, the sort of which we seem to be hearing a lot in this election cycle. So I wanted to point out why, as simply as possible, why attribution is difficult and why every time somebody says that source addresses have indicated something, that you hear every cybersecurity professional loudly groan. So this is the collective groan from the cybersecurity field. Take that from the cybers. Thanks for tuning in. If you like more stuff like this, check out my other projects under Master Monkey and Drone Sound TV, and where you'll find lots of other things that I'm into doing. And stay true, stay low.